What's up, YouTube? Hope everybody's having an awesome morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is, wherever you're at in the world. Definitely early morning for me, so coffee is abundant. But yeah, if you've seen some of my tweets recently, if you've seen some of my streams recently, I've been a little frustrated with the position of Shadow in the current meta. And I say frustrated with Shadow. It's really just frustrated with the Boros matchup. Like, the Boros energy matchup just feels almost unwinnable. There's times where you want to fetch around Blood Moon, but if you do, it means most of your spells are dead. Like, you can't play your Shadows. Your Street Wraiths look a lot worse because now you're not getting Shadows online. Tamio's getting sniped by stuff. You're wanting to play out a bunch of your hand proactively, which makes Psychic Frog look worse. If you really start going to town on your life total to get down to Shadow, you start getting threatened by like Ocelot Pride going wide, Flage going to the face. It's just a really difficult series of events to kind of navigate to make Shadow successful in that matchup. So I've been wanting to try out the Dimir FrogTide deck more. You've seen it on stream a couple times if you've come checked it out. Twitch link down below in the description in case you haven't. And yeah, I wanted to show off some of that gameplay because I have really been enjoying the Dimir FrogTide shell. I think it's a very fun deck. I think it's got a lot of proactive options to it. And yeah, so we'll show off some of that gameplay today. Maybe you guys like it and you want to see some more of it because honestly, I'll probably be playing a lot more of it on stream. So this is the core deck. I actually ended up running this in a challenge and came in top 16. So if you're wanting to see that video, I should have it uploaded pretty shortly. But this was a league that I ran right before the challenge started. So I'm going to run through it so you can see some of this gameplay. The main deck, couple weird considerations. We'll go over those. Sideboard felt really solid. So main deck, 4 Preordained, 2 Consigned to Memory. Weird to see Consigned to Memory in the main deck. The argument I was hearing, because like when I'm putting together a deck list, I'm going through not only what I think is good, but I'm going over results from other players that have been good. I'm going over results from players that I really value the opinions of and really respect. So a lot of my card choices come from people like Pygonti, who's got a lot of experience with Dimir FrogTide. I saw Corey Burkhart won an RCQ with Dimir FrogTide. Ton of respect for everything Corey Burkhart does. So a lot of those considerations I take into account when I'm piecing together the cards that I think are going to work for me. So 2 Consigned to Memory. I've seen 1 in some lists, 2 in some lists. It's the One Ring, obviously, but you have to start thinking about live targets in most common matchups. And against decks like Boros Energy, it hits not only the One Ring, but ETB triggers on a Johnny and Amped Raptor. It hits the Static Prison and Chained to the Rocks ETB. It can stop a Guide of Souls from triggering to immediately get a cat off Ocelot Pride, which some of those aren't the most thrilling uses of the card, but it does mean that it's not dead, and that's a pretty big deal. It's always fantastic against any of the colorless Eldrazi builds. The worst matchup for it, I think, is the Dimir Mirror. You can hit like a Bowmaster ETB and a Psychic Frog attack trigger or combat damage trigger. Honestly, that's about it. So a little bit worse there. but against a lot of the rogue decks, you can hit things like Flay GTB. You can hit Leyline Binding ETB, comes up a decent bit. So, or like a Emperor of Bones, Inner Combat trigger to exile something. So there's a cool number of things that you can snag here and there. It's not the most impactful play, but there's plenty of times that you just want to drop a Frog, drop a Murktide, and have it survive. So being able to snag like a Static Prison right there is really nice. 3 Spell Pierce, 3 Spell Snare. Spell Pierce, I think, is the one that gets people's head turning the most. Really good answer on the draw to like Goblin Bombardment. Also snags the 1 ring really efficiently. You're able to like play out your Psychic Frog, play out your Murktide, whatever. Have a Spell Snare, Spell Pierce active. More importantly, like on the draw, you're able to play a Psychic Frog on turn 3 with a mana up to Spell Pierce and 1 ring. Really big deal. Really nice to have access to. 1 Cling to Dust, 4 Fatal Push, 4 Counterspell, 4 Bowmaster, 4 Psychic Frog. The Shoot the Sheriffs, I've seen plenty of people running like a 1-1 split of Shoot the Sheriff and Go for the Throat. Honestly, I think Shoot the Sheriff is just better at the moment. I think not being able to hit constructs is a big enough reason. Even though Saga is not that popular at the moment, I know my luck that I'm just going to run into some Saga decks. So, yeah, kind of playing the me lottery more than anything else. 3 Force Negation has been an absolute all-star. 2 Harbinger of the Sea. 2 Sink into Stupor. 3 Murktide Regent. So some of the choices here, like no 4th Murktide Regent. I think I already get flooded on them kind of often when I don't want them. So I'm okay cutting the 4th Murktide. 2 Harbinger, no copies of Subtlety. I think Subtlety is just like not very good. You're pretty much only using it to kind of time walk or go down 2 cards to time walk against a cheap card like a Johnny. But because you have 3 Spell Snare, 4 Fatal Push, 2 Shoot the Sheriff, 4 Bowmaster, 4 Counterspell, Stern Scolding out of the sideboard. Like, I don't think those cheap creatures are that big of a deal. Obviously, if you go up against something like Boros and they go 1-drop into 1-1 into 1-2, then yeah, cheap creatures become a big deal. But what was Subtlety doing against that anyway? It's good against opposing Murktides, but still, I kind of think like if you play fairly conservatively and play to disrupt the big turn, then you're not too scared of Murktide anyway. In the sideboard, a 3rd copy of Harbinger of the Seas, 2 Mystical Dispute, 2 Stern Scolding, a 3rd Consigned to Memory, 2 Toxic Deluge, 3 Break the Ice, 2 Surgical Extraction, 2 Nihil Spellbomb. Really heavy on the Grave Hate with the Surgical and the Nihils. 3 Break the Ice and Consign for Tron, 2 Stern Scolding, 2 Toxic Deluge, mostly for Boros, 2 Mystical Dispute, mostly for the Mirror, and Harbinger for any of these random lands decks running around. I find myself against decks like Boros, Harbinger not being as effective as I want it to be. So I like having a little extra to bring in. I've never been a fan of Surgical against Flage, but I've started bringing in Surgical against Boros more often because if I hit the 1 ring, I feel like the game is swinging heavily in my favor. I usually don't have a problem dealing with Flage. Like, honestly, I couldn't tell you the last time I actually lost to Flage, but I lose to the 1 ring all the time. So having Surgical not only be able to hit Flage, but hit the 1 ring is pretty significant. So yeah, let's just go ahead and jump into
the matches. You can see how those went. Talk through them. I didn't expect such an extensive intro. Sorry. All right. On the play, a lot of times I don't really recommend going for Preordain on the play in a blind matchup, especially because my opponent didn't reveal something like Gigantha, so I don't know what I'm up against. But this is kind of the proactivity that Shadow helps out with. I know my hand has lands and I've got interaction, so what I'm missing is a threat. I need something to hit them with. FrogTide in this case, great pickup. Psychic Frog also would have been fantastic with the Force backup. So we'll go ahead and take both of those. Take the third land, take the Murktide. Looks like we're in a Dimir mirror. Nope. Never mind. Esper Goryos. So, wanting to get this Murktide down a little more proactively if possible, but I do have to keep an eye out for Solitude. Under that Archaeologist so they can't start filling up their graveyard. A lot of plays against Goryos are just kind of trying to slow the game down a tiny bit. Archaeologist, if they had flipped over into an Atraxa and they had a Goryos, we had Force Negation up. Now we've got Cling to Dust to potentially hit a big payoff. Really wish I had a Bowmaster in the face of that Cephalid Coliseum activation, but no such luck. Shoot the Sheriff so they can't ephemerate. Again, I've got Cling to Dust up. They go for something crazy, but if they just want to like Emperor into another Emperor, I'm pretty fine with that. I can cycle this Cling to Dust, get down Murktide, and like, I will say this is the reason I hate the basic Swamp. And it comes up so much for me that I end up drawing it and I can't Murktide plus Counterspell. Like, it probably came up 4 times over the course of the challenge that I just couldn't Murk plus Counterspell because of the basic Swamp. I know Pi especially, but some other players as well, have been pretty outspoken about being able to play Harbinger without the basic Swamp. I don't know which one's sketchier. I don't know if it's not playing the Swamp with 3 Harbingers or playing the Swamp with Murktide Counterspell. Still trying to figure that out. So if you've got like evidence to support one way or the other, I would love to hear that. But regardless, get down to Murktide. We've got Force. We've got Spell Pierce for the turn. If we untap, we got Counterspell. I don't care about the Emperor Bones, just like in this case, exiling more Emperor Bones because the game's going to be over before those really start mattering. So my entire plan here is just to stop them from getting an Atraxa in the yard. So I'm aggressively forcing and spell piercing any sort of loot effects or Philology Archaeologist, anything like that. Sideboard. I've seen a couple coverage games. Like, I think Dimir played against Goryos in the MTGO Masters series that Magic Online was putting on. Sideways. And the Dimir player like locked the Goryos player out with Harbinger. I think that's a little too inconsistent for me because all I need is like a basic Swamp and the deck's kind of functional outside of Ephemerate. So I'm not a big fan of keeping the Harbingers in. I'm also not a fan of Consign in the matchup. I understand that it hits the Archaeologist trigger, and it hits the Exile from Emperor Bones and the ETB from Atraxa. But more than likely, if they just like get an Atraxa resolved, you're probably in really bad shape anyway. So I think it's a lot more consistent to fight over them being able to actually resolve the Atraxa than it is fight over the trigger when the Atraxa enters. Now, I will say there's a lot more merit to consign the memory or consign to memory in Dimir Murktide than there is in Dimir Shadow. Because in Dimir Shadow, a lot of times by the point that it matters, you're down to like 5, 6, 7 life anyway. So if they resolve that Atraxa, you just die to that swing. But in Dimir Murktide, there's a reasonable chance you're above 14, 15, 16 life, and you can tank a hit off that Atraxa. So if I saw my opponent with something like Leyline Binding, I'd be more likely to leave Consign in. But until they show me something extra to consign, not as interested in it. But I am interested in Nihil Spell Bombs and Surgical Extractions. Those are pretty straightforward. And Undercity Sewers to try to find another land. Because I've got this Surgical, I don't feel like I'm in a lot of pressure to rush. I just kind of want to hit land drops. Hey, look, there's an Atraxa. Be a hot Surgical target. Go for the Thoughtseize. Definitely going for the Surgical in response to the Thoughtseize because they tapped off of black. And so I don't have to worry about them like Goryo's vengeancing here. I guess I could have been in some trouble if they had played a Black Source, gone for the Thoughtseize. I went for the Surgical. But then I still have Cling to Dust. So I'm not like, I'm covered, right? Yeah, we're fine. And opponent scoops it up to our amazing hand. So, nice. On to match number 2. Pretty good hand. We got Force, we got Fatal Push, we got a Psychic Frog. We're up against the Giganta deck, so some sort of energy shenanigans. Okay. I could Fatal Push the Guide of Souls in response to the Ocelot Pride because I do have the Psychic Frog to follow up on 2 that can stand in front of Ocelot, or I have the Bowmaster that can shoot it down. Honestly, my thought was, okay, they just play a single 1-drop here. I Fatal Push the Ocelot Pride. They get a life and an energy. I get the bigger threat off the board. And I get to untap and play Psychic Frog instead of being like pressed into Bowmaster. So that was my plan. Just Fatal Push the Ocelot Pride on second main. I did not think that they were actually going to have a second 1-drop with Ragavan because most of these energy decks are just like Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, and not going Ragavan as well. Or at least most of the ones I run into. So that was maybe, I don't even want to say a bad decision. Yeah, go for the double block. Bowmaster gets bolted. It's fine with me because that's a bolt that's not going to my Frog. Now I've got like Frog that I can pitch to survive bolt. I can force a negation of Static Prison. This is why I did not play out that Think into Stupor. So I'd have an extra dead blue card to just Static Prison off of. Force negation Static Prison off of. Down a Murktide. But yeah, just I wasn't expecting double 1-drop on turn 2. off the basic mountain. So I wasn't as interested in pushing the Guide of Souls. I'd rather just push like the payoff. But if I'd known they had double 1-drop on the ground, I probably would have pushed the Guide in response to the cat and then just Bowmastered like the Ocelot on my turn 2 and had tokens to stand in front of the Ragavan. But either way, it's all good. We're going to shoot everything in the face and then hit him in the air with a big Murktide. They want to pump the Guide here. That's fine. I'm at a healthy life total, so I'm not concerned about the Guide. I'd rather just like save these cards in hand. Now I will say you can discard the land here for the extra counter on Frog. When I'm in a stalemate board position like this, I say stalemate, like I'm in an advantageous board position, and I really want to find specific cards like Counterspell more than I want to worry about that one counter on the Frog, especially since it doesn't pump the Murktide if I exile. So I'm more interested in getting value out of my fetch lands as potential surveils like this to help filter into my draw off the Frog than I am off of the counter. The counter just like doesn't really matter, but if I can filter into a counter spell, that's like game ending. Bowmaster is a reasonable pickup. So really expecting them to just like windmill slam a 1-ring here. Anything else kind of doesn't matter. I guess 1 ring and Static Prison are the only things I care about. This attacks whatever. I don't want to spend my mana because if my opponent does have a Static Prison, I want to be able to Cling to Dust in response to potentially draw a card. Maybe find a Spell Pierce, find a... In this case, I would have found a Sink into Stupor, which would have let me, into turn, bounce the Static Prison, untap, exile, Cling to Dust, or discard Cling to Dust. Yeah, Cling to Dust would have been in the graveyard. Exile Cling, exile Shoot the Sheriff, exile Sink into Stupor to put 3 counters back on my Murktide, make it a 6/6. Frog would be 7. I'd attack in for lethal. So even if they had a Static Prison, we're still winning that game. Sideboarding against Boros. This is where I've been kind of wishy-washy in my sideboarding. Harbinger, I like to keep 1 in on the draw, 2 in on the play. Just for that possible gotcha chance. Really doesn't come up that often. A lot of times Boros is pretty aggressively playing around Harbinger. And since they're a Blood Moon deck already, it's really easy for them to get basic planes. And then all they got to do is get like a basic mountain in their hands, kind of fine. Spell Pierce, I like a lot better on the draw than on the play. But I think I sided it out this game because... Why did I side it? Oh, I know why. So in the challenge later, I swapped up my sideboard plan a little bit. I boarded out Bowmasters on the draw and kept in the Spell Pierces and I think 1 Consigned to Memory. And then on the play, I brought the Bowmasters back in and took out the Spell Pierces. So this was just like a test match, trying out keeping in the Bowmasters. Then ended up swapping that out a bit later. Hot take. I think Bowmaster is actually not good against Boros in this Dimir Murktide shell. I think in Shadow,
you don't have a lot of options, so you kind of have to keep playing them. But I think in Dimir Murktide, you get better options, especially since you're bringing in stuff like Toxic Deluge. You can afford to trim some like the lower quality cards. And since Bowmaster doesn't kill Guide of Souls, doesn't kill a Johnny, doesn't do anything in the face of Flage, okay against the One Ring, but usually they've got so much like spot interaction that it doesn't do much. So yeah, I think it ends up being like 2 mana, try to shoot down an Ocelot Pride, which is bad on the draw, good on the play. That's why I board out the Bowmasters on the draw. So we get to Spell Snare Raptor, get a Frog down. Kind of hoping they'll just commit a bunch to the Frog. They want to go for the Flage route, so we'll ditch a land and a Deluge. So I can keep this Nihil Spellbomb to take out the Flage. Start hopping in with the Frog. I figure since they didn't go for like a Static Prison or a what's it called? A Static Prison or a Galvanic Discharge on their turn 3. They went for the Flage instead. They probably just don't have one. So I'm a little more aggressive with getting this Frog online. Unfortunately, like I said, towards the start of the game, or the start of the league, the One Ring is absolutely backbreaking. So most of the time, this entire match revolves around stopping your opponent from resolving a One Ring. Fortunately, not a lot you can do if you're sitting here with a bunch of like Spell Snares and Toxic Deluge, which is again one of the reasons that I've liked Spell Pierce in the matchup and why I'm more likely to keep them in post board and board out the Bowmasters. I think stopping the One Ring from coming down in the first place is a lot more conducive to victory than something like this where I let the One Ring resolve and yeah, they just kill my Bowmaster. They're gonna shoot me in the face with Bombardment. I know that they still have an Ajani, so like hoping to find a way to answer the Ajani. Unfortunately, Harbinger of the Seas just ain't it. Especially when your opponent's drawn, what, 10 cards off their One Ring? Spoiler alert, that's a lot of cards. 10 cards for a deck that's average CMC is like 1.5. That's a lot of extra plays that your opponent gets to make. So, that one out of here. Go on to game 3. Get to be back on the play. Pretty good hand with land into Counterspell into Deluge. Ocelot Pride to start going wide. But that's okay. I just want to be able to set up my basics. Also, Deluge looks a whole lot better on the play than it does on the draw. Because, like, on the draw, if my opponent had another turn, and then I got to untap and had to go for a Deluge, then I just concede to the One Ring. Like, I can't do anything about it. I can take another hit off Ocelot Pride and Guide. But then you start getting into, if they have another play, then Guide starts getting enough energy to like fly the Ocelot. And now I got to pay more life for Toxic Deluge, plus take another big hit. Just not a very winning line. But instead, we get to start counterspelling and Bowmastering and everything else because we regain that tempo advantage while being on the play.
Decide to let the Hearse resolve, because like if I do find a Frog or a Murktide right away, this Hearse isn't really stopping me from getting those down. They might not be as impactful, but I can still resolve them. If I have to rely on hitting my opponent with a Bowmaster and a token for 8 turns, a little less consistent. But I've got Fatal Push for any small threats. I've got counter spells for any 2-for-1s. Decide to counterspell the Flage. Go for the Surgical. Mainly because I don't want the Flage just absolutely neutering my clock. Because if they take out my Bowmaster and gain 3 life, then all of a sudden my 7-turn clock turns into a 16-turn clock. And that's a pretty big difference. We know they've got a Giganta and an Unknown. Got 4 lands, so got a counterspell a Giganta if it comes down. Pick up a nice little spell snare for the Amped Raptor. Take more counter spells, because at the end of the day, like, we need counter spells and we need a threat. Really the threat part. That's a threat. Is it a very imposing threat at the moment? No. Is it a threat nonetheless? So the reason that I let the Static Prison go there is if my opponent's last card is a 2-power creature, then they get to just crew up the Hearse and kill me. So I have to let the Static Prison go so I can hold up Counterspell in case they do have a threat. Or Fatal Push, because depending on what the threat is, I might let it resolve and then Fatal Push the Unlicensed Hearse. And at the end of the day, I do still have this Orc army kind of chugging away. There's a 2-power threat that crews a Hearse. Hey, look. Threat. The threat that presents lethal next turn. I probably should have just played out this Dark Slick Shores earlier to have the mana. It's kind of fine since I eventually drew the Psychic Frog anyway, but I don't know. Having like Cling, Escape, Cling. I guess with the Hearse, that's never happening anyway. Oh well. On to round number 3. On the play. On the play with a Fatal Push into Counterspell into Harbinger. And this is the kind of unfair curve out I really think you need in Dimir to be kind of plausible. Also, these situations, my opponent has the chance to fetch up a basic mountain if I go for a Harbinger. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to Windmill Slam it there if I know that they can play around it based off what's off board or what's on board. So instead, if I don't do anything, they're more likely to just go for a Surveil Land, which means if they go Surveil Land and to play something on their turn that I can interact with, Counterspell, Spell Pierce, then I can potentially have them tap out on their turn or tap down. Maybe they don't have another red fetch. They pass back. I get my 4th land so I can Harbinger plus Spell Pierce in case they've got a Bolt or a Discharge and they want to float mana to try to kill my Harbinger. Going for the Patient line is more likely to pay off. See them add a Giganta to hand. We get down Harbinger, hold up Spell Pierce in case of a 1-ring. But it looks like they do not have a copy of Static Prison. I'm going to play out my 4th blue source, hold up double Counterspell, and hopefully just attack them from now until the end of time. And I basically put them on a 9-turn clock where they have to draw now 4 copies of Static Prison. I mean, like Ocelots, Guide of Souls especially, I don't care about. A Johnny, I'm definitely countering. But it's not a long list of stuff that I have to worry about. And any red card in their hand is just dead. So, Static Prison number 1, gone. Spell Pierce does look a little bit worse on turn 10 than it does on like turn 4, turn 3. You have to keep that in mind. But I think these are the games that people really point to with Harbinger and say like, oh, well, Harbinger like solos the Boros matchup. But you have to take into account that my opponent could have gotten basic Mountain. They chose not to. We got lucky on the Harbinger plan there. Like, we slow rolled it. They chose not to play around it. Multiple factors went into play to make that Harbinger plan work out. I also appreciate the energy deck's ability to like always have Guide plus Ocelot. Super impressive. We do not find a Deluge. We do find a Frog. So if they don't have a Static Prison, we might be okay. Oh, Bombardment's pretty rough. Yeah, they can fly the Ocelot. If I discard to block the Ocelot, I've got a 3/4 Frog. First strike damage goes through. They sack a cat token. I have to discard another card. They sack another cat. I discard another card. They sack a Guide of Souls. I'm out of cards. Frog dies. Ocelot Pride deals damage. And yeah, they run away with it from there because I've got no cards in hand. They've got a live Pride that's flying with a Goblin Bombardment. Not a winning line. So I have to just take the 3 off the Pride there. Hope to top deck a Deluge. I don't see one off the Frog or off the Surveil. Hit him in the face because Deluge is my only out at this point. Anything else, I'm just dead in the water. So we don't find one, scoop it up. Go to game 3. Oh, I remember this game well. So hold up Cling to Dust just in case we get a redraw off like a fetch land into a 1-drop. Plus, just showing off the turn 1 untapped black source means that they might get scared off playing a 1-drop on 1, which is better for my counterspell on 2. The Guide, no follow-up, so I'm assuming that they're sitting on like a Galvanic Discharge for a Frog. Blood Moon into the counterspell. Feels good for the home team. Like, we're doing a reasonable job of managing this this tempo game in the first few turns. Counterspell an Amped Raptor. Fortunately, they have a second Amped Raptor. So, Fatal Push the Guide there for the sole purpose of them not being able to Amped Raptor into a 1-ring. They can already Amped Raptor into everything else in their deck.
So if they hit like a Blood Moon, I've got to force pitch Murktide anyway. So any other 1-2 drop really doesn't matter. But limiting the upside of Nulldrifter into one ring would at least cut some amount of draws out as potential hits for the Raptor. And since I don't care about the Raptor body-wise, I might as well hit the Guide of Souls that lets them get up to the energy needed to fly the Amped Raptor. Or they'd have the energy needed to fly the Amped Raptor anyway, with the Guide of Souls that actually give flying. And ironically enough, they do flip into a one ring, and they couldn't cast it because we killed the Guide of Souls. So, here's the big brain play now. Play out our polluted delta, so we've got another Surveil land. Could have played out the Murktide Regent there. I kind of wanted to Surveil no matter what. So maybe it was a little greedy to wait an extra turn. Like, I really just wanted to Surveil and try to find something impactful. Opponent shocked in this Sacred Foundry. So I know they've got Giganta in hand, 2 unknowns. They shocked in the Sacred Foundry. So the assumption would be, oh, they've got a Bolt or Galvanic Discharge. If I play out the Harbinger, I don't have the mana to protect it on my turn with Force. Even though Harbinger into Murktide would be pretty lights out here. But if I play out the Murktide, then I can hardcast Force to protect it. I'm not dead to Bolt if they attack him with the Amped Raptor. So, context clues. We saw them start to hardcast the Giganta, and then they took it back and played a Ragavan. 2 very different plans here. The immediate reaction on my side is, okay, the energy. They get the 1 energy off the Ragavan. Now a 4/3 Raptor plus 1 energy and a Galvanic Discharge is 8 damage to my Murktide Regent. So now I immediately think, okay, one of their unknown cards is a Galvanic Discharge. The only thing that makes sense. About the only reason that you would play the Ragavan over the Giganta here. So they attack him with the Raptor. We say, okay, I think you've got a Galvanic Discharge. You do. We've got Force Negation for the Discharge. Now you just have to hope your one other blind card isn't good. They don't play out anything. All right. Didn't attack with the Murktide Regent. The reason being is if they attack with the Ragavan on the way back, I'm never trading Harbinger with the Ragavan there because the Harbinger's got him locked out of red. So if I'm not going to trade the Harbinger, but the Ragavan hitting me is going to unlock their red mana, then I kind of have to sit back with the Murktide for a turn or two and assume that they're locked out. Unfortunately, Boros being locked out means they have the 1 ring. So that plan went out the window very quick. I say it went out the window. It wouldn't have mattered. So I would have hit them with the Murktide. They would have 1 ringed anyway. But if they kind of draw poorly, if they draw a bunch of red cards, then if I find an answer to the Ragavan, so I put myself in a position to just 2-turn hit them in the face. Now, unfortunately, in case you're unaware, the 1 ring is a busted Magic card that should probably not be in the format anymore. So they find a Static Prison for my Harbinger. Let's count the ways we die. Static Prison for Harbinger. 1. Goblin Bombardment. Great way to deal or play around Shoot the Sheriff. 2. Ocelot Pride after they got their Guide of Souls. I could kill the Guide of Souls here. Honestly, doesn't really matter that much. I'd rather kill the Ocelot Pride so they don't get the extra token. Johnny, 4. So now they have the Ocelot Pride down. So if I go to kill the Johnny with the trigger on the stack, they can stack the Ocelot Pride to the Goblin Bombardment, flip the Johnny, then make a cat and shoot me in the face. If I let the Johnny fully resolve, they can sack the cat to the Goblin Bombardment, flip the Johnny, shoot me in the face. If I respond to them sacking the cat with the shoot the sheriff on the Johnny, they can sack the Ocelot Pride, flip the Johnny, shoot me in the face. You see where this is going. All roads kind of lead to me dying miserably. But yeah, that's the One Ring. That is pulling victory from the jaws of defeat. We are 2-1 on to round number 5. Probably could have gone turn 1 preordain here. I said like in one of the earlier games that I like the preordain on turn 1 to try to find like the psychic frog. It changes up a little bit based off your interaction. So in this case, I've got Fatal Push on turn 1. I'd really love to Fatal Push into untap with all my mana available. So I think holding up the Fatal Push is a little better. The other game, I don't think I had Fatal Push on 1. I might have. I'll have to go back and check that. But either way, up against Eldrazi, we do find a Consign and a Force of Negation, which is fantastic. We just need to find a Harbinger. Go for the Kozilek's Command, the little known exile 2 cards from the Yard mode. Honestly, I don't care about that mode, and I kind of like the idea of not showing them Consigned to Memory in the main deck. So, because this Kozilek's Command is just Scry 2, draw a card, I don't care about them exiling cards out of my yard. I'm just going to let it go and save the Consign for something more impactful. Now, if they had, like, Scryed 2, drawn a card, and made 2 Scions, I would have countered it. I kind of do the exact same thing here, just like exile my yard, draw a card. Cool. Oh, both of our main deck Consigned to Memories against the Eldrazi opponent. That's pretty sweet. We'll Devourer. Just counterspell that. I want to save these Consigns to be able to take out cast triggers as well. I do think that's really important to hold on to them as long as I possibly can. One ring. Force negation that. Yet again, holding on to Consigned to Memories for dear life. Bowmaster is not the greatest clock, but it is by all technicalities a clock. If there's anything the game of Magic has taught me, it's that technically a clock is better than not a clock. Now that's a clock. Going all like Crocodile Dundee on them, like, that's a knife. Frog. You get the idea. A lot funnier if you just don't think about it and laugh. So all is dust. We'll get a Consigned to Memory. In a situation like that, I actually think it's kind of free to replicate the Consigned to Memory once. Opponent's got 4 mana up. There's always some chance of some janky, colorless counterspell or something that I just don't know about. So it's pretty free just to get a second copy of Consign on the All is Dust.
We're going to ditch everything but this consign. Really try to put the pressure on our opponent. Get this game over with ASAP. I'm kind of hoping that I've got 2 more draws I get to see. I've got a consign. All I need to do is find like 1 more counter spell, and I should be able to get out of it. Again, pretty free to just replicate the consign. All right, sink into super. We'll take it. Not great against everything, but it's great against some things, and that's about all I need at the moment is great against some things. Great against that as long as you don't have another Tron land. Sweet. So, it did take double main deck consign to memory, but beating Tron in game 1 is absolutely huge because we get to go into sideboarding with all of our copies of Break the Ice, extra consign to memory, board out all these terrible removal spells. Boarding in a Surgical Extraction, it's almost exclusively for the One Ring. Not going to give spoilers on this next game, but almost exclusively for the One Ring. Then if you're up against Through the Breach, you could like hit Through the Breach itself, but otherwise, bring in a Mystical Dispute is a bad mana leak, because if your opponent's locked out with like Harbinger of the Seas, then anything is worth leaking, right? Opponent flips over a Myco Spawn and a Kozilek's Command to their Devourer trigger, which is kind of interesting because those were like 2 of the best cards in the matchup against us. So I was kind of surprised to see that, which makes me terrified for whatever they kept. It could have just been like the Uggin's Labyrinth there. Stonebrain on turn 1. I don't care about Stonebrain as a Magic card, but the way it lines up with this hand is kind of annoying. So if they resolve the Stonebrain and I have to spend my turns like preordaining to find land, then I risk them just sacking the Stonebrain, like naming Harbinger, naming Murktide, naming Frog. And if any of these pieces go away, my hand just kind of gets a lot worse. So I figure since I've got the backup consigned to memory, and I'm just trying to get to Harbinger, clearly not working out too well. Nope. We'll scoop to the One Ring. One Ring. One Ring, One Ring, One Ring. Why are you still in the format? Come up with a good answer for that. I would love to know what it is. But this hand, much better. We've got turn 1 consigned for the map. We've got turn 2 get down a Frog. Got stuff. Got things to do. They can't Kozilek's Command our Frog, so we know we're going to get at least 1 attack in with it. Break the Ice, fantastic pickup. Remember when I said spoiler alert earlier? So my opponent's going to Kozilek's Command for 1. They're going to make an Eldrazi spawn. Kind of cool. And I'm going to go to their draw step and Surgical Extraction targeting their Kozilek's Command. Because I do think that is one of the best plays they can make this turn, is another Temple or an Uggin's Labyrinth, Kozilek's Command, exile my Frog, draw a card, like while I'm tapped out here. Really just like exile the Frog, make 2 more spawns. Something like that. So I'm going to Surgical Extraction the Kozilek's Commands, because then they would have to have Labyrinth to be able to play a One Ring. And if they do have a Kozilek's Command, then they're kind of, I don't want to say priced into just cycling it for a card here. But either way, they decide to sack off their spawn. So now I know they can't have a 3-drop or a 4-drop this turn, which is really nice for me. So let's rewind. Let's rewind before I lose my words here. Here. So they do have the Labyrinth. They do have a 7-drop. They do have a 1 ring. They do have another Kozilek's Command. Just want to point that out. Like, everything that we were afraid of, they have access to. They could have Labyrinth, exiled my frog, made 2 Scions, or drawn another card. They could have let it go and played their Labyrinth, exile the World Breaker, play the 1 ring. I honestly don't know why they didn't go for that lane, or why they didn't go for that line. Why they chose to cast the Kozilek's Command instead of the 1 ring. Maybe they were afraid of me having a copy of Force of Negation. But either way, we got a little fortunate there. Hit with a frog. Do find a land, so I'm just going to windmill slam this Harbinger. Even though I'm locked out of black, it's kind of fine. We're going to Stonebring my counter spells. Makes sense because they have a 1 ring in hand. Discard all these lands because I do not care about them, and I want to make sure this is a 2-turn clock. We're okay playing out the Murktide because even if they 1 ring here, there's still 3 lands off of All Is Dust. It is quite a ways away. Spell Snare not doing anything for me, so we're just looking for like a Force of Negation or Consign to Memory. We don't find one, but opponent doesn't find anything either. So we're going to steal game 3 against Trump. On to match number 5. Pretty good opener on the play. We've got Pierce and Fatal Push. We've got a Frog. Because I find this Bowmaster, I'm just going to hold up mana instead of slamming Frog into an unknown opponent with open mana showing. I don't want them to Spell Snare or potentially like Galvanic Discharge or something. Thundering Falls, Meticulous Archive, Solitude. So I'm assuming Jeskai control. Does seem like a very aggressive Solitude on the Bowmaster. I was a little bit surprised by that. Like, especially if you got Flayed, you can afford to take a couple hits off that Bowmaster. Another Psychic Frog. Alright, so Dress Down means that it's the more likely the Dress Down Nulldrifter deck, which makes a lot more sense as to why they would aggressively hit the Bowmaster there. We'll discard some stuff to keep the Frog alive. Keep the Consign to Memory because it does answer Nulldrifter, also answers like ETB off of Flage. And I believe we're just going to Windmill Slam the Harbinger here. Like, I was uncertain, and then I drew the Force of Negation. It's like, oh yeah, we're doing this. This is my game plan now. This is my life. Draw 2 off the Nulldrifter, go to Consign it. We'll force the Consign, and opponent's going to scoop it up there. Nice. Force of Negation coming in hyper clutch. Sideboarding against this Jeskai deck. Harbinger looked really bad. Like, their whole combo, they can play off blue mana, the Dress Down plus Nulldrifter, Consign. So I don't think Harbinger's where I want to be. It does shut off Flage, but just like the Boros matchup, I don't feel like I'm losing to Flage, so I don't really want to play around it that hard. I thought about bringing in the extra Consign, but it only really stops the Nulldrifter. okay against like the ETB on Dress Down, but that's still less than Nulldrifter, so it's literally just consigned for Nulldrifter. Boarded out a Spell Pierce and some pushes because push doesn't hit Nulldrifter. Kept in the Shoot the Sheriffs in one push because I can hit a Flage with Fatal Push and I can hit the Nulldrifter with Shoot the Sheriff. Boarded in a couple copies of Surgical because I don't know if they're on the One Ring or not, but if I can hit like Nulldrifter or Flage or the One Ring, any of those, I'm kind of happy. Mystical Disputes, absolutely great here. Bunch of reasonable cards to bring in. You have a Surgical. We've got a Preordain. Love us a good turn 1 Preordain. The likelihood of them having something impactful on turn 2 is really low. Aggressively Spell Pierce the Dress Down because Pierce is going to get worse the longer on this goes. And opponent misses their 3rd land drop. So now I'm even like more happy about piercing the Dress Down. Oh, they do find the 3rd. Want to Spell Snare. If I thought that they had like a 3rd copy of Dress Down, then keeping the Spell Snare would probably be okay. But that's just like a really big if, right? Like, more than likely, they just have a Nulldrifter in hand or a couple Nulldrifters in hand, something. Here, I finally decide to be smart and replicate the Consign to Memory because they could have a Mystical Dispute. And I don't really want them to be able to take out my Consign. A Surgical the One Rings before we go for the Nihil Spellbomb. We see that they have a Nulldrifter and a Flage in hand. So they were trying to open up the graveyard for Flage. Makes sense. Hold up Cling to Dust to be able to exile the Flage if we want to. Do find the land to be able to evoke the Nulldrifter. I was kind of surprised at the evoking the Nulldrifter here. I feel like it's probably better to just go to their next turn and actually hard cast the Nulldrifter, but I guess to each their own. Got more consigns, so at this point, like, I'm just looking for a threat. If they find more Nulldrifters and able to start hard casting them, then things get a little bit rougher for me. But if they just find Flages, I'm thrilled about that. Do have Spell Snare in case they've got a counter spell. Snare the Dress Down. Now we've got Shoot the Sheriff to kill the Flage if they get that back pretty soon. Otherwise, Consign to Memory to hit Nulldrifter. Speeding up our clock a little bit. Pretty much at this stage, like, anything I can reasonably afford to ditch to the Frog, I want to ditch to it. Because I do want this game to get over with about as quickly as possible. So, Mystical Dispute. Counter that, because I've got the Murktide covered. Or I've got the Flage covered. Now, I will admit that I shocked in or bolted in this Sink into Stupor, thinking, okay, if they find a fetch land, then they can fetch, get back Flage, but I can fetch down to 3 and counterspell. And then I'll have like Consigned to Memory for any follow-up. So if they play like another Flage off the top, I can consign the trigger, and the game will just be over by the time it matters. Because I've got lethal next turn with this Psychic Frog exiling half my yard. I didn't really think about options past that, because if they found like a Galvanic Discharge or something, they wouldn't be able to kill anything. If they found a Wrath the Skies, then I could just like start nuking my entire yard to grow the Murktide up to a one-shot. I've got Preordained, Spell Pierce, Dispute, Snare, Counterspell, Surgical, Cling. And if I discard one of these spells out of my hand, then the Murktide just becomes a one-shot. So anything that kills the frog is fine. I let that go and counterspell the Flage. That was kind of like my whole thought process. Then they played a Solitude, and I was like, well, if I counterspell the Solitude, then that puts the 5th card in the yard, and they can just escape the Flage, and I have to fetch down to 3 to counterspell, and then I die. Then I realized, oh yeah, I have it consigned to memory. I'm an idiot. Just counter the ETB trigger on the Solitude. It doesn't go to the graveyard. They can't escape the Flage. I don't lose the life. And I just got a Flying Psychic Frog and a Murktide next turn. So, definitely the joy of getting to the end of a league that's been like 2.5 hours. And all you can think is, oh, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I just cast the cards 5-head. Magic's easy if you just put your stuff on the stack. Okay. So, what do we think? What do we think? What do we think? Force Negation, great. Harbinger, pretty solid. I might end up moving the Harbingers to the sideboard. I think it cheeses matches every now and then. But there's a lot of like mental back and forth when it comes to Harbinger. We saw like a game, it snuck out a win against Boros because they didn't play around it. But if they had played around it, then Harbinger would have just been dead. And most of the time, I don't like cards that your opponent can play around and just hope they choose not to. I think that's kind of a, I don't want to say losing strategy. It's just inconsistent. And one of my biggest pet peeves is inconsistency. Like, even if the thing you're doing isn't good, if you do it consistently and you can plan on it, then it's got some innate power to it. With Harbinger, it's consistent against some decks and just inconsistent against others. So I'm still messing around with it. The 3 Spell Pierce might be a lot. I know a lot of people are running like Consider in that spot, which is perfectly reasonable. But I do like having the extra answers to the One Ring in the main deck. So I'll probably stick with the Spell Pierce for now. It's also really good against like Goryos. And that matchup can be kind of rough. Also really good against Storm. So yeah, with enough like good matchups for Spell Pierce, it's probably worth keeping in the main deck. In the mana base, I ran 3 basic islands over the 3rd Darkslick Shore. That was something that I saw in Corey Burkhart's list that I really liked. I hate Darkslick Shore. Comes in untapped, or comes in tapped after turn 3 in way too many crucial situations. So I'll probably end up replacing those with the new Duskmourn land, the one that's like comes in untapped, taps for blue. If you control an island or a swamp, it taps for black as well, or taps for blue or black. I think that card outside of like turn 1 is better than Darkslick Shores. So probably be trying it out. The basic swamp still annoys me to no end. I wish that I could like have a blue Manamorphose just to be able to play out Psychic Frog under Harbinger of the Seas. because I think this basic swamp messes me up more than anything else in the deck. Also a little awkward with Break the Ice against like Tron, because you want to get your 2 like blue-black shocks early or Undercity shock early. And then you kind of have to get the basic swamp on 3 if you want a Harbinger. But I don't know. We're still messing around, seeing what kind of configuration works best. But if you're liking this Murktide content, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear back from you. Like I said, hoping to play this deck a lot more. I've got the challenge video coming out before too long, so look forward to that one. Otherwise, link down in the description for the deck list, for the Twitch in case you want to catch a live stream, Twitter in case you want to know when that live stream is happening, and the Discord. If you want to come join the Control Freak Discord, talk all things Murktide, Shadow, anything else modern or non-modern, then come over, say hey, tell us what you got going on. Other than that, I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. Thank you so much for coming and checking out the video. Adios for now.